All right, joining me for a segment of Kyiv Together is Christy Pirano. Christy, welcome.
Thanks for having me.
So, I don't know if it's been a little bit of time since we did like an update, but the Ukrainians have been making methodical progress in Kherson. And last I heard, last week they famously drove drove the Russians out of the Kharkiv area. And the last bit of information I heard was over the weekend where apparently they've now crossed that river, have taken Kupiansk, and apparently the Ukrainians are still making methodical progress. I'm curious to know what you know, though, Christy.
Basically the same as what you're seeing. I think that like their counteroffensive surprised the Russians and really the world at how fast they were able to make progress. It does seem like a few weeks ago the Russians were kind of slowly gaining ground, and now they're fairly quickly losing ground. And it's probably a combination of things, both like, I mean, supply line deficiencies might be kind of catching up with the Russians. I'm sure that the Ukrainians are a lot more motivated than the Russians are. Um, and I mean, I also think that there was some pretty heavy weaponry that in recent weeks the US finally got around to donating to the Ukrainians, which they've made good use of. So yeah, I'm tracking the same thing that you're seeing. Like there are definitely some really impressive counteroffensives, but then also, not surprisingly, but sadly showed more evidence of mass atrocities by the Russians. Like, I mean, there was one town that where they found like a mass grave of 400 people, including just entire families that had been murdered by the Russians. So I think it is just showing the sobering realities of the human rights abuses that are being perpetrated in these occupied areas.
Yeah, and Russia has also increasingly resorted to bombing civilian infrastructure such as power plants and dams, and they're getting more desperate. I've been hearing they've been sending more prisoners to the front lines. So I mean, Russia appears to just be getting completely desperate, right?
Yeah, and also I think that some of these, quite honestly, are the same tactics that we know they've used in Syria, like including against Kurdish people for a long time, and they've just never been held accountable for the human rights abuses that they've perpetrated in other areas. Like they have, I think there's good intel showing the Russians have been behind like bombing hospitals in Syria. But I think there's too much of a mentality is that like there are going to be atrocities in the Middle East and there's nothing we can do about that. But then all of a sudden, when it's in Europe, I think it's more, I think it just surprises people more when they commit these same atrocities in Europe as they have been doing. But yeah, I mean, I do think that they're getting more desperate, and also they've been allowed to do these kinds of atrocities in other areas for so long, and they have not been held accountable. The world has just kind of wanted to look the other way on both, I mean, Russia as well as China and other regimes that um, have committed these mass atrocities. And then, I mean, they don't. I mean, a lot of these bad actors really don't take the Geneva Convention or other things seriously. Um, so yeah, the reality is that they have no qualms about doing horrific human rights abuses if they think it advances their objectives, however twisted their objectives are.
Yeah, and as far I'll just get up and say it. What's been happening in the last several weeks in Ukraine, in my opinion, has been an infomercial for Ukrainian NATO membership. Like, I think, quite frankly, NATO needs Ukraine more than the Ukraine needs NATO. My goodness, they have been fighting tremendously and making staggering progress against the Russians in the last few weeks. And I I feel like they make a great country. I think that they make a great NATO member once all of this is sorted out.
Yeah, I hope they are able to join NATO. And it does, like, I think this is driving more interest and appreciation for NATO. And it's sort of ironically, this has driven countries to increase their military spending, which was one of the things that President Trump talked about. And the Trump administration was never really diplomatic in how they went about it. But it was a issue that President Trump raised is that some of these European countries and NATO weren't really that interested in spending all that much on defense, and now all of a sudden it's like what seemed what seemed just like an American administration causing stirring up trouble, and now all of a sudden people are like, oh, actually, this is a problem. We do need to take this seriously. Not that I don't think President Trump ever intended to strengthen NATO. It really seemed like he was kind of pro-Russia and he didn't really like NATO. I think he was really using it as an excuse to weaken NATO. It's just like, oh, these guys aren't paying their fair share. Let's just do away with this whole thing. But it is just really ironic in a way that that I do think President Trump was at least. I think he himself was fairly sympathetic to Russia. I think his administration was a little bit like there were a lot of national security professionals in his administration that were tougher on Russia, but he himself was pretty weak on Russia, in my opinion. But it is to me interesting that, and and he said dumb stuff about like, oh, Putin is just it's an act of love for him to defend his to expand his country and stuff like this. But then it's interesting that the action and reaction and now European countries are like, oh, actually, we do need to actually spend money on defending ourselves.
Yeah, I mean, the worry I have is like if the Trump it gets a second term, could he pull the United States out of NATO?
Um, Possibly, but I'm not sure if the president's supposed to be able to unilaterally cancel a treaty. It probably depends on how much the Senate goes along with it. I certainly hope he doesn't get a second term. I think he is very corrupt and was very damaging to U.S. national security. So I've been pretty critical of the current administration as well. I do believe the current administration could have taken a harder line approach before the invasion ever happened instead of like tucking tail and running when Russia started building up troops and we're like, oh, okay, here, Russia, just give us a minute before you shoot so we can get out of here.
And that press
I mean,
conference that we both reacted to back in the beginning of the year.
yeah, so I mean, I believe the Biden administration should have taken a much stronger approach to Russia before the invasion ever happened. And I think they have been slow. Well, they have sent a lot of weapons to Ukraine. Some of these like higher powered weapons, there was quite a bit of fooling around on some of this stuff where it's like, oh, well, we're going to give it to Germany. They're going to get there. Oh, never mind. Russia doesn't want us to give it to Germany to get it to Ukraine. And there was, this sort of thing. So, but I mean, in recent months, the Biden administration has provided a huge amount of military aid to Ukraine. And Ukrainians are making good use of that and making good progress. But I do think that Trump very likely could have been worse for Ukraine than I mean, I am willing to criticize the current administration for their shortcomings, but President Trump was always very kind of pro-Russia, and he's even in recent weeks he's made like pro-Russian comments. So I would have no confidence in the Trump administration having done a better job, even though I am critical of the Biden administration's shortcomings. But so yeah, I do not believe that Trump's comments about NATO members not paying enough were out of a desire to strengthen NATO. I think they were more a desire to do away with NATO by coming up with a reason to get rid of
Right.
it.
I
And yes,
don't
I
I
would
don't
share
want to
your
stop you there.
concern.
I know we're on a limited time here. I do want to ask another question, which is
Okay,
that,
sure.
I'm just curious to know if, given the fact that Ukraine has basically confounded all of our expectations so far, is it time to reset our expectations of what's possible? I mean, could we now like see the possibility that this goes so badly for the Russians, like the Russians get routed that Putin is unable to hold on to power, and like is it possible that someone who succeeded him could basically get on the phone, or that maybe he gets on the phone with Zelensky and basically says, hey, if you let us have Crimea, we'll get out of the rest, or something like that. Like I think we need to really expand our horizons about what is possible, given the Ukrainians have basically overshot all of our expectations thus far.
Possibly, but also I'm not. I mean, I guess at some point the Russians may need to save face in some way, but also the Ukrainians are saying that they don't want to give up on Crimea. So yeah, I mean, like yes, it could be a much more favorable outcome for Ukraine than than people were expecting, and certainly makes all the thinkers that were like, oh, well, Ukraine just needs to cave into Russians' demands and, there's no way they can defend themselves. It certainly makes that type of thinking look pretty stupid. Um, but I'm not sure if Putin is really close to losing power. I know there's some speculation he's actually like terminally ill and this is sort of like his last hurrah, but I don't know if there's really um any good intel
Oh
on that, or
wow.
if that's just
It,
people that want attention on
so
social media by
he's like
making
Henry
wild claims.
he's like Henry the Eighth, who basically on his deathbed he basically said, "Hey, let's go on one last conquest of France."
Right, there's no speculation about that, but I'm not sure if that has any basis in like actually solid intel, or if it's just like people that there was that famous picture where Putin's like sitting at this really long table. So people were like, oh, maybe he's like really sick and doesn't want to get COVID because he's like already really sick or something. So that could just be totally born out of wild speculation of people wanting attention. So I'm not sure we have any um solid intel on that. But I do think that these things can seem too big to fail until they're not. So yeah, I mean, I think Putin Putin's regime could be much weaker than, I mean, it was supposed to be like the world's second best military, and I saw one tweet a while ago that said that everyone thought that Russia had the second best army in the world. It turns out they have the second best army in Ukraine.
Yeah, no, and apparently, someone did like a chart of the big world's biggest contributor of weaponry to the Ukrainians, and Russia was the number one spot.
Yeah. Yeah, so I think it's entirely possible that maybe their political power is a little bit like their military power, and that we just sort of assume that it's more than it is. But I guess there's so many of these bad eggs, and there's always this like, oh, this is gonna implode, and you know, and sometimes it's like something sort of does implode, and then but then what you end up with is worse than what you had before. Like Pakistan is really a mess, and I mean their previous president was forced out, and now they have a new president, but the reality on the ground hasn't really changed that much. I mean, basically the military has a lot of powers. Yeah, you have the president's forced out, you have a new president, but you still have the country is still just corrupt with just as many issues as before. So I guess I wouldn't. As much as I would love to see Putin gone, I'm not really qualified to comment on how likely that is. And my second question would be, if he is gone, is he going to be replaced with someone just as bad, or would it be actually a chance for somebody better to, rise to power? But as much as evil regime can be weakened, that's great for the whole world.
Right. And speaking of Pakistan, before we go on to talk about Russia's southern border, we could do a brief cobbled together segment if anything has come up in Afghanistan recently.
I think one interesting thing is that there's a guy who, I think his name is something or another, Zakir, and he was formerly in Guantanamo Bay. Then he was released, and of course, any promises he made to not go back to fighting were fake. So he was sent to the Panjshir Valley to try to. That's like the one spot where there has been some military resistance to the Taliban. So he was sent there to get things in order, and he was apparently gravely injured a few days ago. So he is now in a hospital in like high security. There were rumors that he had died, and apparently the belief is that he's injured but still alive. But that is kind of an embarrassment to the Taliban, because they made a big deal out of sending their best and brightest to just squash the resistance. And then after a couple of weeks, it's like, oh, never mind, we had to evacuate him to go get treated. So that seems that will potentially embolden resistance forces, because the Taliban's like anti-resistance campaign is becoming kind of chaotic, because especially with the absence of this guy, they've kind of lost discipline there in Panjshir. Oh, I guess another thing about Afghanistan that hit the news is that there's a new prisoner swap between a guy who was accused of smuggling tens of millions of dollars worth of heroin into the U.S. For an engineer who is an American citizen who had worked in Afghanistan for 10 or 11 years and was kidnapped by the Haqqanis a couple of years ago. So good news for his friends and family. There's some musings that maybe this is to pave the way to recognize the Taliban, which I certainly hope that's not true, because everything they've done has proved that they are the terrorists that they always have been. They have done nothing in their treatment of women, minorities, former Afghan government and soldiers. They've done absolutely nothing to earn any international recognition. Like they are a band of terrorists that are more interested in murdering people than running a country. So I certainly hope the Biden administration doesn't plan to actually recognize them. Um, but I mean, I'm
Yeah,
glad for the friends and family of this guy who was released. I'm glad he's able to come home after that ordeal.
right. So, I mean, let's talk about what's been going more about what's going on in Russia's southern border, because it's not just Afghanistan. Apparently, in two separate places, there's been acts of aggression. Apparently, uh, Azerbaijan has invaded Armenia, or at least invaded Armenia a few days ago, like sometime last week. And then, and then after like a few days of fighting, like he'd taken a number of Armenian villages, like Armenian positions on the border. Basically, Armenia, like certain segments of Armenian territory appear to be occupied. Same thing happened in Kyrgyzstan just a few days later, with the Tajik army taking several, taking the Kyrgyz, at least one Kyrgyz village, and so I mean, it's not entirely clear to me what exactly has been going on in both places, but apparently the big thing to note is that Armenia is a member of like Russia's version of NATO called the CSTO, and but Russia was facing aggression from Azerbaijan. Sorry, Armenia facing Azer from. Why can't I talk? Russia was only able to offer tepid support for Armenia, which has actually transitioned to becoming more of a democracy, saying, oh, we're concerned about what's going on, but he basically didn't offer any help, which sort of cheapened the guarantee of the CSTO. And so, but whereas apparently Pelosi within hours basically visited the country and basically was able to bring some sort of end to the conflict. And was the one in Kyrgyzstan and is ongoing, and both countries are members of the CSTO, and Putin is also seemingly understood, probably because he's has more important things to worry about in Ukraine. But it's
Now,
also,
is Tajikistan also a member of the CSTO, or they're
yes,
not?
apparently Tajikistan and Kyrgyzstan are both members of the CSTO.
So it's a little bit, it puts, I mean, Russia's supposed to be protecting everybody in the CSTO, but it's an interesting situation for them when one of their like member countries is attacking another member
Right.
country.
And what's interesting to note is that, like Ukraine, apparently Kyrgyzstan is actually the first Central Asian country to actually have a color revolution and transition to some sort of democracy, which is, none of the other Central Asian Soviet countries have done so, but Kyrgyzstan apparently has. And, so I guess it's very fathomable why Putin would not take Kyrgyzstan's side on this, because Kyrgyzstan's new form of government stands in opposition to everything Putin believes in. But I think it's very telling that Putin's guarantees of security seem to be very cheap, and there's the possibility, I think, that maybe more and more countries could transition to being aligned with the West, and Russia becoming even more isolated.
Yeah, I mean, I hope that will be the result. And certainly Russia has their hands full now in Ukraine, but also, like you said, Russia is maybe more concerned about supporting the countries that, are not democratic. And so so those countries like Armenia that have transitioned to being more democratic may not endear them to Putin's regime.
Yeah, I'm wondering, like, even if the whole CSTO network could potentially just collapse, like, with, because apparently Uzbekistan was in it at one point, Georgia and Azerbaijan were in it at one point, but they left at certain points. Putin's word of, I mean, just yeah, I mean, there's not a lot we can say about it, because again, I don't totally fully understand what's been going on there in the last little while, but apparently it's potentially big. I'd like to research this more though. um
Yeah.
yeah, I mean, what is there anything else that's been going on in that area that's of note?
There's massive flooding in Pakistan. They still have like 20 or 30% of their population displaced. So it's basically adding a natural disaster on top of a already political and economic disaster that they had going on.
Right. And so we're gonna keep an this is gonna be a short episode here. We're gonna keep an eye on some of the stuff that's developed. Christy, is there anything that you want people? I want to first of all, I want to thank you for coming on. But I also, is there anything that you want people to follow, websites you want people to visit, accounts you want people to follow as always?
Yeah, so my Twitter account is at Christy Prano, and then the organization that I'm vice president of, which is Kurdish Alliance of North America, is at Kurdish Alliance, and we try to raise awareness of issues facing U.S. allies, especially Kurds, but also Afghans. We also have some ongoing humanitarian projects in Afghanistan, so people can donate if they wish to try to help support families that are waiting for their U.S. visas. And yeah, there's other, I think there's also Tarjaman is another organization assisting Afghan. There's if someone's really interested in Afghanistan, there's a group that does, they called Operation Snow Leopard. They have just kind of a newsletter, and it really just compiles the biggest stories from all over the world that in English that talk about Afghanistan for that day. So, and they kind of sort through different intel reports. So, and kind of keep track of the conflicts and stuff. So if you're kind of an Afghanistan situation nerd, then that's a good resource if you want to keep track of that. And it's a pretty quick and easy read, especially if you just want to skim through it and see the headlines. And so yeah, I would recommend that if someone is really interested in tracking the goings on in Afghanistan.
Yeah, for sure. And I encourage you guys to check all those out and stay afloat. We're going to keep track of this stuff. We encourage you to get involved yourself in sort of keeping an eye on the news, and also getting involved to help people out who really need it.